Hi, my name is Emma Comstock-Reed. I'm an 8th grade math teacher, and this video is going to be about how to use math language routines to support student thinking. And specifically, I'll be talking about the lessons for week 30, days 5 through 9, which are pulled from lessons 3 through 5 in OpenUp Resources 8th grade Unit 8. So the lessons for this week are going to cover the topics of rational and irrational numbers. And the first day of the week is going to be answering the question, what is the solution to the equation x squared equals 2? On the next day, day 6, students will be addressing the big question of what is an irrational number. On day 7, students will be working to find the length of a diagonal line segment on a grid. On day 8, students will be plotting square roots on a number line. And on day 9, students will be determining which whole numbers a square root is in between. So if you've taught these topics to 8th graders before, you've probably experienced that they can be somewhat challenging for students and difficult to visualize. So one really excellent thing about the OpenUp Resources curriculum and about the first lesson for this week is that it covers the topic in a visual way. So you can see what students are asked to do on the first lesson is to draw 3 different size squares and then talk about the area of the square they created, the length, and set up an equation that relates the length of the side length to the square. So the idea of squaring and taking a square root is very visual for students, which is one way to make it accessible for them. Another way that OpenUp Resources works on making these kinds of topics accessible for students is by having a story of a lesson and using instructional routines to support students' thinking. So I'm going to show OpenUp Resources kind of literature on that topic next. So now I'm at the OpenUp Resources website. It's just access.openupresources.org. And on the website, they have a section called Course Guide for grade 8. And I'm looking under the section, how to use these materials. So OpenUp Resources philosophy is that each lesson and unit tells a story, and that they tell the story of math over the course of 9 units. So the idea is that we have, within a lesson, the mathematical purpose of the activity and its place in the learning sequence, what students are doing during the activity, what a teacher needs to look for while students are working on an activity to orchestrate an effective synthesis, and connections to mathematical practices when appropriate. So this idea of synthesizing student thinking is really important, and it's something I'm sure you've had to be creative about in this hybrid remote environment. So one part of synthesizing, according to OpenUp Resources, is language routines. So if we have the big structure of the lesson is launch, work, and then synthesize, that synthesize piece might be something you have to be creative about depending on how much time you have synchronously with your students. So during the activity synthesis, which is the most important part of the lesson, the teacher needs to orchestrate some time for students to synthesize what they have learned. And it's used to ensure that all students have an opportunity to understand the mathematical punchline of the activity and situate the new learning within the student's previous understanding. And one way that they mainly do this is by using instructional routines. And the ones I'm going to talk about specifically are the mathematical language routines, because they come up a lot in the lessons for this week. This is going to be a very brief overview and connected to the specific lesson that starts off this week in week 30. But if you are interested to learn more about mathematical language routines, there are a lot of free resources and descriptions if you just search mathematical language routines. And specifically, I would add Stanford University to make sure you're getting the right ones. There are 8 of them, and we're going to look at some of them right now. So we will focus on 2 of the math language routines today, MLR2, which is collect and display, and MLR8, which is discussion supports. So you can read about them in this section, how to use these materials, on openupresources.org. You can also read in more detail about them if you look up the math language routines and Stanford University. For today, we're just going to look at how do these routines come up in the suggested lesson that is going to be covered on day 5 and day 6, the first 2 days of week 30. So this is the introduction/launch for day 5. And you can see that it asks students to find a positive solution to each of the following equations. And OpenUp Resources suggests that we use discussion supports, MLR8, to go over these answers. So if you're working with students synchronously, here are some questions that can help you facilitate a productive discussion. So these suggestions have to do directly with that problem we were just looking at. And this is a strategy not only to support English language learners, but to support any student in discussion about math. So one suggestion that it says is to display sentence frames for students to use as a support when they explain their strategy. For example, I noticed that blank, or first I blank because blank. When students share with a partner, you can prompt them to rehearse what they will say when they share with the whole class. And rehearsing will provide students with additional opportunities to clarify their thinking and to connect how they will communicate their reasoning. And then you can see we have some specific questions to involve more students in the conversation. For example, did anyone have the same strategy but would explain it differently? Did anyone solve for the value of x in a different way? Does anyone want to add on to blank strategy? Do you agree or disagree, and why? And some of those questions are great to use in any discussion, but specifically in this problem, you want to think about what students know about the multiplication of fractions that help them find the value of x squared in each problem. Because if we look back at the problem itself, students are going to need to have a deep understanding of fractions in order to come up with a reasonable response for 3 of the 4 of these questions. And prompting them to hear each other and to explain their thinking clearly can help remind students of some fraction knowledge that they might have forgotten. So now I'm on day 6. What is an irrational number? And this is still pulling from that same lesson from OpenUp Resources, lesson 3. And in this part of that series, we are talking about the solution to the square root of 2. So for their launch, students are answering the question, are any of these numbers listed a solution to the equation x squared equals 2? So that launch prepares students to address in their Explore section this question. So on slide D, it says on slide A, we examined some numbers that were close to the square root of 2. Find some more rational numbers that are close to the square root of 2. And this is an example of something that you could do asynchronously or synchronously, and it's using the math language routine collect and display. So above the section on our math language routine to collect and display, this is just another note to keep in mind when you're facilitating this lesson. So as students work, it's possible that they'll focus on the decimal form when searching for a rational number close to the square root of 2. And then if that happens, encourage students to think back to what they did in slide A and kind of connect that story of the lesson so that they can think of some fractions that might be even closer to the square root of 2. So these suggestions under collect and display are written for the idea of synchronous instruction. However, you can also collect a lot of what you see students writing later and display it for them the next day, so that students can kind of get that same exposure over the course of just a little bit longer time. If you are working synchronously, what you can do is have students work on in pairs, discuss strategies for finding rational numbers that are close to the square root of 2, And then this is the key part of collect and display, which is that you're going to record the words, phrases, and quantities students use on a visual display. Invite students to review the display and ask questions to clarify the meaning of a word or phrase. So synchronously, you can do this in the moment and include it as part of the lesson. Asynchronously, look back at students' work, collect it so that they can look at it the next day and ask those same kinds of questions, encouraging them to look back to the visual display during whole class discussions as this idea comes up again. Thank you for joining me. I hope this was a little bit helpful to be exposed to some math language routines. I encourage you to look more into them. They're really helpful. Have a very nice day.